everyone. I would just like to start by saying thank you to Dr. April Quincy for welcoming my paper and to say I'm really looking forward to the event. There are so many interesting sessions scheduled and I'm really excited to come along to as many as I can. My research, which I am currently writing up as my PhD thesis, investigates the social identities of children in ancient Greece across the 9th to 4th centuries BCE. In particular, I look at evidence from Athens and its hinterland Attica, dated to between 900, the start of the geometric period, and 323, the death of Alexander the Great, when the Hellenistic period began in Greece. I concentrate on the social identities of children as they were constructed and experienced amongst their families, largely in private contexts, and I look at how their identities developed and transformed throughout the extended life course, a sociological concept that explores that individuals' identities go beyond those that are embodied. I am an archaeologist, so in particular I investigate the material cultures of children and childhood. My PhD evaluates depictions of children in iconography, their burials and descriptions of them and details about childhood provided in ancient literary sources to identify material culture, objects, that were used to construct juvenile identities in the geometric, archaic, and classical periods. I considered geometric, black, and red figure painted pottery to investigate children's lives, and I evaluate burials, grave stelae, marble grave markers with figural scenes, and white ground painted pottery used in funerary contexts to explore children's identities as they were demonstrated in contexts associated with death. Analysis of those 6 evidence categories reveals a catalogue of objects associated with children, the material culture of children and childhood, which I use to investigate how children use domestic space and how far children may have been conceptualized to have had extended life courses in ancient Athens. Today, I am going to talk to you about children in classical Greece. I am defining children as juveniles before puberty and speaking of the classical period as between 480 and 323 BC. I will talk about how depictions of children in artistic media and their burials can be analysed to gain an awareness of the material culture of children. I will discuss that the material culture of children comprised of, and I will discuss my methodology of using it to investigate children's lives in private and domestic contexts in classical Greece, including how they use spaces within houses and what their use of space indicates about the nature of their relationships with members of their families. Previous scholarship has generally overlooked or dismissed children when investigating ancient Greek houses. Children have been described as invisible in excavated houses and considered inaccessible in the archaeological records of domestic contexts. But children were formally buried and depicted in iconography consistently from at least 900 and throughout the classical period, which I am talking to you about today. They were directly associated with objects in both burials and in iconography on painted pottery and grave stelae, as well as in literary sources, and those items are what I consider the material culture of children, particularly because a number of them were exclusively associated with juveniles. My methodology for investigating children's lives through investigating the material culture associated with them proposes that examples of children's material culture can be sought in excavated houses to identify some of the spaces that children used within domestic contexts, because they were used in day-to-day household contexts and were made from robust materials that are preserved archaeologically. Their distribution can be mapped to suggest which spaces children accessed and used. Comparative analyses of their found contexts suggest whether children are likely to have spent time with men, women, or both in those spaces. For example, my methodology can be illustrated with a case study of terracotta figurines, dolls. Terracotta figurines of female figures that can be considered dolls and are sometimes specifically engineered as dolls with movable limbs were included in burials. The middle image shows a doll accompanied by some miniaturized objects, including a throne and boots, that was buried in a grave with a maiden. It is now in the British Museum. Similar figurines were included in burials from the geometric period throughout until the end of the classical period. Dolls are also depicted in iconography on grave stelae. You can see this on the top image. A girl gazes lovingly down at her doll. And in white ground scenes, you can see this in the bottom image where a girl offers her doll at a tomb. Terracotta figurines of types that can be termed dolls are also found in excavated houses, where they would presumably have been played with by girls on a daily basis. In some classical houses that I will discuss with you in later slides, they were found in certain spaces that can be said to have been accessed and used by children. Thinking about the classical period, there are four key types of evidence that can be catalogued and analysed to detail the material culture of children in 5th and 4th century Greece. Red figure painted pottery was produced from 530 until 300. Pots used in various contexts for a range of purposes were decorated with figural scenes, and children were illustrated in family groups, with siblings, and for the first time children were commemorated for their own sakes in iconography from the 5th century, in scenes that showed them alone. They were often shown playing with toys and animal companions. In all, I catalogued and analysed 775 red figure illustrations of children. I catalogued and analysed 364 classical child burials, and children had been formally buried from at least 900 BC. They were usually buried alone in their own graves, and they were typically interred with grave offerings, often pots for eating and drinking, and toys. Grave stelae marked graves, including the graves of children, around 530 and then between 430 and 317. The stelae showed children alone, when they had presumably marked children's graves, as well as with siblings and amongst family groups that incorporated up to 6 figures. The children often played with toys and animals, as they did on contemporary red figure vases. In total, I catalogued and analysed 415 stelae. Finally, children were illustrated on white ground painted pottery that was primarily used in burial contexts, interred as grave offerings throughout the 5th century when grave stelae were not used. Scenes show children, usually in the company of their parents and especially their mothers, visiting tombs, making their own journeys to the afterlife, and playing in daily life scenes that were apparently set in domestic contexts. I looked at 55 white ground scenes including children, most of which directly associated them with some material culture. Ultimately, children were directly associated with a range of material culture in the 4 categories of evidence, either because they were buried with them or because they were shown interacting with them in iconography. To summarise briefly, that material culture was as I have detailed here. Infants were shown in high chairs in red figure scenes. Shells were offered to children in burials and may have been amulets which younger children were shown wearing in scenes in red figure and white ground. Feeding cups, or feeders, were associated with younger children in red figure and burials. Children of various ages were associated with coups in black and red figure iconography and in scenes on stelae. Children were also interred with them in graves. Coups were a specific form of jug that were usually adorned with scenes showing children and were used by children when they celebrated a rite of passage when they were around 3 years old. Yo-yos were only illustrated in red figure. Hoops were played with in red figure and white ground scenes, and rattles were used to entertain infants in red figure scenes and on grave stelae, as were balls, which were also buried with some children. Astrogalloi, which were knuckle bones used for games including a version of the modern jacks, were shown with children in red figure scenes, on grave stelae, and buried in graves, often in copious amounts. Terracotta figurines, including anthropomorphic figures that I have already argued could be dolls and animals, were included in burials and interacted with in scenes on grave stelae and white ground vases. Children played with rollers or more elaborate toy carts in scenes on black and red figure and white ground painted pots and on grave stelae. You can see on the right that most of the objects were associated with children throughout the classical period from 480 to 323. High chairs, shells, feeders and yo-yos were exceptions. High chairs and shells were only represented until around 400 BC, feeders from circa 470 until then, and yo-yos were only represented in preserved scenes that were produced between 460 and 440. Some of the types of material culture can more viably act as signifiers of children in archaeological contexts, because they were made from robust materials that are preserved and they had strong, almost exclusive links with children. In particular, terracotta figurines, high chairs, feeders and coups have special potential. Rollers or toy carts were probably made from wood, which is perishable and only preserved in exceptional circumstances, so they cannot be sought in excavated houses. Hoops are similarly limited. Amulet strings were likewise typically perishable, probably made from natural fibres in most cases. They are not found in burials and cannot really be sought in houses. Shells may be examples of them in burial contexts, but that cannot be determined for certain, and they could be signatures of various other activities, so would be insecure signifiers of children in excavated houses. Astrogalloi are well preserved, but they could just as easily be food preparation waste, and so cannot be taken as secure indicators of juvenile activity in domestic contexts. Rattles and yo-yos are sometimes preserved archaeologically, but they are not generally recorded in houses. They need to be identified on a case-by-case basis when evaluating assemblages excavated in houses. Balls can serve various other functions and also need to be assessed on individual bases. Ultimately, the key examples of material culture that can serve as archaeological signifiers of children in classical domestic contexts are identified as terracotta figurines, especially of animals and dolls, high chairs, feeders, and coups. They can be sought and their distributions can be mapped in excavated houses to investigate how children used private, domestic spaces in classical Greece. Olympus was a classical settlement in the Chalkidiki in northern Greece. Its location is indicated on the map to the right, with the location of Athens also marked. Olympus was ruled under the jurisdiction of the Athenian Empire until 432, and then it maintained links with Athens, including through trade subsequently. The city was sacked by Philip of Macedon during one of his campaigns into Greece in 348. The destruction and the consequent rapid desertion of the site resulted in exceptional preservation that is not the norm for Greece, where well-preserved houses are few and far between. The site was extensively excavated in the earlier 20th century, with a particular focus on recording small finds, which is invaluable given my focus on investigating where and how small finds were used. I am now going to discuss with you the distribution of small finds, material culture, associated with children in two houses at Olympus. House AVII-4, situated on the north hill of the settlement at Olympus, was a type house for classical Olympus with a central courtyard and an adjoining pastas, or an open portico. The house was constructed and then occupied consistently from around 432 BC. The house was partially burnt in the destruction of Olympus, but the ground plan was relatively well preserved, as was an extensive small finds assemblage. More than 100 objects were found across the 11 spaces when the house was excavated in the 1920s. Particularly to do with children, terracotta figurines that could be termed dolls, like the British Museum one shown here, were recorded in space I, the focal courtyard highlighted in yellow in the plan on the right. The space was predominantly used by women according to the wider finds assemblage, as was space B, highlighted in red, which was a workroom. The presence of women was especially evident in the prevalence of loom weights in those spaces. In contrast, the predominant male space was the andron, highlighted in blue, which was used to host symposia, drinking parties used to affirm male citizen identities. Children's material culture was not found in undrawn spaces. The arrow on the plan indicates the location of the entrance. The space to the left, which could be accessed separately from the street, has been described as a shop. The kitchen, which is often one of the few function-specific rooms that can be located in ancient Greek houses, was located in the northeastern corner in the top right here. Ultimately, in House AVII-4, archaeological signatures indicate children accessed at least one space, which was relatively public within the house. They apparently spent their time there in the company of women, and they occupied themselves by playing with terracotta figurines that functioned as toys. The House of Many Colours, also termed House FII-9, was more elaborate. It was situated in the villa section of the settlement at Olympus to the southeast of the site. The house was occupied from the late 5th century, and it, like the previous house, was apparently partially burned during the sack of Olympus, and the result of the destruction was relatively good preservation. Around 300 distinct objects were recorded, including 98 vessels that were in a complete state, when the house was excavated in 1938. The house comprised 13 rooms, and artifact distribution analyses indicate children used at least 5 of the spaces. A terracotta figurine in the form of an animal was found in space B, which was apparently an ancillary small courtyard to the main living and workspace, space A. Further terracotta figurines, arguably dolls, were excavated in space H, which was the flue for the kitchen. They were more probably waste deposits. Miniature vases, a jug and a cup, were found in space F, which was an anteroom. The image shows an assemblage including some similar artifacts which was found in a classical grave. All in all, the distribution of artifacts associated with children in the House of Many Colours indicates juveniles accessed all of the yellow spaces, either because examples of their material culture were found within them, or because they were routes of access to other spaces where children were active, like the portico. The patterning mirrored patterning that was apparent in all of the houses I analysed. Children's material culture was typically with women's material culture, and never in male-only spaces like the andron. The material culture typically consisted of toys, suggesting children were occupied by play when they were being cared for by women within the confines of the oikos. Literary source evidence from ancient Greece postulates that children, especially the youngest juveniles, spent most of their time within the household under the care of women. In the late 5th or early 4th century, Xenophon of Athens proclaimed, "Since both the indoor and the outdoor jobs demand work and care, the god, from the first, adapted a woman's nature, I think, to the indoor and the man's to the outdoor works and cares. Knowing he had created in the woman and imposed on her the nurture of newborns, he meted out to her a larger proportion of affection for newborns than to the man." Aristotle, in his 4th century Politics, contended children, up to the age of 7 years old, must necessarily be reared at home. A citizen wife in Aristophanes' late 5th or early 4th century comedy The Lysistrata bemoaned that it's a lot of trouble for women to get out of the house. We're giving hubby a hand, or waking up a slave, or putting the baby to bed, or bathing it, or feeding it a snack. The assertions of the literary sources must be looked at critically, given they demonstrate the perspective of only a few elite men. But iconography and the archaeology of domestic spaces apparently support the sources' proclamations. They all affirm women were children's primary caregivers, and children spent much of their time in women's company within the oikos. This affirmation comes from analysing the distribution of preserved examples of the material culture of children in excavated houses. The classical material culture of children has been shown, through analysis of iconography and burials, to be various, including terracotta figurines, high chairs, feeders, coups, rollers or toy carts, protective amulet strings, astragalloi, rattles, hoops, yo-yos, shells, and balls. Figurines, high chairs, feeders, and coups are the securest examples that can viably be employed as archaeological signatures of children's activities in domestic contexts. The distribution of some of them in excavated houses at the classical settlement of Olympus has illustrated that children accessed various spaces within houses, but usually spent most of their time in the vicinity of open-air courtyards and main living or workrooms that were the primary domain of women. Children spent time in those spaces with their female caregivers, playing. Ultimately, I have suggested to you today, investigating the material culture of children demonstrates that the house was a private locale in classical Greece, one in which children had a place to play and to be children. Thank you everyone for listening, and I look forward to questions and discussion at the live event in June.